Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet, Eduyot. We are up to Perek Aleph, Mishna Yud Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana Ranbaev, Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Chana bat Miriam, Sason ben Raya, and Yehoshua ben Shifra, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen. And Avdi ben Chaim Lechaim, v'derefua shelemav, Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, v'tor Shacholei Yisrael, and Achlama Merav, Binyamin, Or Tzion Chai ben Dvorah. The next three Mishnayot discuss cases where Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel disagreed at first, but Bet Hillel later changed their mind and agreed with Bet Shammai. This Mishnah also appears in Yevamot, chapter 15, Mishnayot 2 and 3. Elu devarim shechazru Bet Hillel loorot kedivrei Bet Shammai. These are the matters in which Bet Hillel retracted their original ruling and started to rule like the opinion of Bet Shammai. The first matter, Ha'isha sheba mimidinat hayam v'amra met ba'ali. If a woman went with her husband overseas and she came back from overseas and said, my husband died, Tina said she is believed and she may remarry, met ba'ali. Similarly, if her husband had no children and she said, my husband died, tityabem, she is believed and she performs yibum with his brother. When a married man dies without children and he has one or more brothers, the widow must marry one of the brothers. This marriage is known as yibum. It's in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 25, verses 5 and 6. In our case, the wife performs yibum based on her testimony that her husband died. Generally, matters that involve marriage must be decided based on the word of two witnesses. However, in order to make it easier for a woman to remarry after her husband dies, the sages ruled that she is believed to testify that her husband died, and she is allowed to remarry based on her own testimony. And this law was established as the result of the following incident. A man died from a snake bite while harvesting grain. His wife came to a nearby court and testified about his death. After verifying that he was indeed dead, the court gave her permission to remarry. As a result of this incident, the sages ruled that a wife's testimony about her husband's death is accepted. This man had been harvesting grain with a large group of people, and yet his wife was the only witness to his death. Because of this, the sages realized that it is often difficult to find two witnesses to testify about a man's death. If a woman would not be allowed to marry unless two witnesses saw her husband's death, a woman might be unable to remarry even though her husband died, simply because his death was not seen by two witnesses. Therefore, the sages allowed the leniency of accepting the testimony of a single witness about a man's death, even if that witness is the man's wife. The Mishnah teaches that the details of this law were originally the subject of a dispute. Bet Hillel say, Lo shamanu ela beba'a min hakatzir bilvad. We have not heard that a woman is allowed to remarry based on her own testimony that her husband died, except when she comes from the grain harvest, meaning from a field near the city, and testifies that her husband died nearby. This is what happened in the case which the sages established the law, and it is only in such a case that they approve the wife's testimony. If a woman testifies that her husband died overseas, though, she is not believed. According to Bet Hillel, her testimony is accepted when she says that her husband died nearby, because a woman is afraid to lie about something that happened locally, since it can be easily verified. However, if she says that her husband died in a distant country, which is a matter that cannot be easily verified, she is not believed. Bet Shammai challenged Bet Hillel. Amru lahem Bet Shammai said to Bet Hillel, surely you agree that a woman is not only believed when her husband died exactly as in that particular case at the grain harvest, achat abba min hakatzir v'achat abba min hazetim. Rather, it is clear that whether a woman comes from the grain harvest or whether she comes from harvesting olives, she is believed to say that her husband died, because there is no reason to differentiate between these settings, even though the law was instituted as a result of an incident in which a man died while harvesting grain. So too, even if a woman comes from overseas, her testimony is accepted. Lo dibru bakatzir ela ba'oveh. And the sages who established this law mentioned the grain harvest only because that is what happened. When the sages instituted this law, they said a woman who comes from the harvest and says her husband has died may remarry. Bet Hillel assumed that the law applied only to someone who came from the harvest or somewhere similar. Bet Shammai argued that coming from the harvest is only an example. However, they meant to approve a woman's testimony about her husband's death, no matter from where she comes. Chazru Bet Hillel leorot kebet Shammai. Bet Hillel then retracted their original ruling and began to rule like Bet Shammai. The Mishnah cites another matter in which Bet Hillel retracted their original opinion. When a man gets married, he writes his wife a document known as a ketubah, in which he guarantees that if he divorces her or dies before her, she will collect a sum of money, usually 200 zuz, from him or his estate. The Mishnah cites a dispute whether a woman who testifies that her husband died may collect this money based on her testimony. Bet Shammai Amrim, Bet Shammai say, Tinaseh v'titol ketubata. A woman who testifies that her husband died may remarry and she may collect her ketubah payment. Since she has believed that her husband is dead, she may collect her ketubah, which is a widow's right. Bet Hillel Omrim, but Bet Hillel say, Tinaseh v'lo titol ketubata. She may remarry, but she may not collect her ketubah payment, because the testimony of a wife is usually not valid testimony. The sages allowed us to rely on her testimony only in order to allow her to remarry. In order to claim the ketubah, she has to produce 2 valid witnesses that her husband is dead. As for every matter of monetary law, the Torah states that matters of monetary law must be decided based on the testimony of 2 valid witnesses in the book of Dvarim, chapter 19, verse 15. Although the sages allowed the leniency of accepting a woman's testimony about her husband's death, they approved this leniency only in order to allow her to remarry. Her testimony cannot be relied upon for anything else. Now Bet Shammai challenged Bet Hillel's ruling. Amru lahem Bet Shammai said to Bet Hillel, Hitartem et ha'erva chamura. You have permitted the serious matter of a forbidden relationship, allowing a married woman to remarry based on her testimony. Lo tatiru et ha'mamon hakal. Will you not rely on it to permit the less serious matter of money, granting of the ketubah? If her husband is actually alive, her remarriage is adultery, which is a forbidden relationship punishable by karet. Collecting the ketubah unlawfully involves only the less serious sin of theft. If we rely on her testimony to let her remarry, we should certainly rely on her testimony to let her collect the ketubah. Bet Hillel respond, Amru lahem Bet Hillel said to Bet Shammai, Matzinu she'en ha'achim nichnasin ha'nachala al pia. We find that even though we allow her to remarry, the brothers and other heirs of her husband cannot come into the inheritance of his property based on her word, meaning they cannot inherit his property unless 2 valid witnesses testify that he is dead. So it's clear that even though her testimony is relied upon to let her remarry, it is not relied upon for matters of money. Therefore, her testimony cannot be relied upon to collect the ketubah. In reply, Bet Shammai give a different reason for their ruling that she can claim her ketubah based on her own testimony. Amru lahem Bet Shammai said to Bet Hillel, V'alo misefer ketubata nilmod. But we can learn from the text of her ketubah document that a woman may collect the money of the ketubah based on her own testimony. Shu chotevla, for her husband writes to her in the ketubah, Shim tinasi la'acher tidli ma shekatuv lich. When you will be eligible to marry another man, you may take what is written for you in this document. So the collection of the ketubah depends on her ability to remarry. Meaning, although it is true that her testimony cannot be relied upon for monetary matters, her husband agreed to give her the ketubah once she is out to remarry. Since when she testifies that her husband is dead, she is given permission to remarry, she collects the ketubah as well. Chazru Bet Hillel leorot kedivrei Bet Shammai. Bet Hillel then retracted their original ruling and began to rule like the opinion of Bet Shammai. And that is then of Mishnah Yud Bet. Mishnah Yud Gimel, which also appears in Gittin chapter 4, Mishnah 5, discusses a Canaanite slave who was owned by 2 partners and then freed by one of them. He is now half slave and half free, meaning half slave and half ordinary Jew. When a Canaanite slave is freed, he becomes a full Jew and has the status of a convert to Judaism. Someone who is half slave and half free, he works one day for his master and one day for himself, meaning the income from one day of his work belongs to his master, and the income from the next day is his own, and so on. The half slave and his master are equal partners in everything the half slave earns. The sages decreed that the income be divided by giving one day's income to the master and the next day's income to the slave. Divrei Bet Hillel, these are the words of Bet Hillel. Bet Shammai challenged Bet Hillel. Amru lahem Bet Shammai said to Bet Hillel, Tikantem et rabo. With this arrangement, you have solved the slave's master's problem of how to get his fair share of the slave's work. But you have not solved the half-slave's own problem, meaning he is stuck in a situation in which he cannot marry. He cannot marry a slave woman because the half of him that is free has the same laws as a regular Jew, who is forbidden to marry a slave woman. The Torah prohibits marriage between a Canaanite slave and a regular Jew. in the book of Dvarim, chapter 23, verse 18, with Targum Unkulus. Bat Chorin eno yachol, and he cannot marry a free woman, an ordinary Jewish woman, because half of him is a slave, and a regular Jewish woman is not allowed to marry a slave. Libatel, shall he give up marriage altogether and not bear any children? Va'alo lo nivra ha'olam ele lepirya u'rivya, but the world was created only so that people would have children who would populate it. Shenemar loto bera'ah l'shevet yitzara, as it is stated in the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, verse 18, God did not create the world to be deserted, He formed it to be inhabited. Now the Mishnah chose this verse in Isaiah instead of the more familiar verse in the book of Bereshit, chapter 9, verse 7, be fruitful, multiply, because that verse is a mitzvah that applies only to ordinary Jews and not to slaves, while the verse in Isaiah applies to all mankind. Since God's plan for the world was that people have children, we must find a way to let the half-slave marry and have children. Bet Shammai state what should be done, rather for the benefit of society, to make it possible for the slave to marry and have children. We force his master to free the half that he owns and make him a completely free man, so that he may marry a free woman. And to compensate the master for his loss, the slave must write a contract that obligates him to pay the master half his value. When the freed slave has that amount of money, he must pay it to the master. Even though the master must free the half-slave to make it possible for him to marry, the master does not have to suffer a loss in doing so. The half-slave must therefore compensate the master for freeing him. Now these rulings apply not only when half the slave is free, but even if a smaller portion is free. For example, if 5 masters own 1 slave and only one of them frees his portion so that the slave is a fifth free, the other 4 masters must also free their portions of the slave so that he may marry a free woman and bear children. Chazru Bet Hillel leorot ki Bet Shammai. Bet Hillel then retracted their original ruling and began to rule like Bet Shammai. And that is an Abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen va'amen.